in the spring of his 23rd year on the throne, a throne he had technically occupied since he was a child, but had never truly held. A pharaoh named Thutmose stood before his war council at the fortress city of Yehem on the southern edge of the Carmel mountain range in what is now northern Israel, and listened to his generals tell him he was about to make a catastrophic mistake. The enemy, a coalition of more than 300 Levantine city-states, led by the king of Kadesh, the most powerful and most strategically positioned of the Syrian city-states, and backed by the formidable kingdom of Mitanni, had assembled its forces at the city of Megiddo on the far side of the mountains. There were 3 routes through the range. 2 of them were wide, well-known, and safe, roads that an army could march along without fear of ambush, roads that allowed chariots to maneuver and supply wagons to follow. The 3rd route, the Aruna Pass, was a narrow mountain defile, so tight that the army would have to march single file, stretched out for kilometers with its head exposed and its rear unprotected. If the enemy had stationed even a small force at the exit of the pass, they could have destroyed the Egyptian army in detail, killing the lead elements before the rest of the column could arrive, trapping thousands of men and horses in a stone corridor with no room to fight and no way to retreat. The generals recommended the wide roads. The generals recommended caution. The generals recommended the sensible, the prudent, the militarily orthodox approach. The approach that any competent commander, following the established principles of Bronze Age warfare, would have chosen. The approach that the textbooks would have prescribed. The approach that would have kept the army safe and intact and operational. The Aruna Pass was a gamble, a calculated, strategically informed, meticulously considered gamble, but a gamble nonetheless. The army that entered the pass was the army of a pharaoh who had waited 22 years for his moment, and who was not willing to let that moment be squandered by caution. The decision was not reckless. It was the opposite of reckless. It was the product of a mind that had spent 2 decades analyzing the military landscape of the Levant, studying the dispositions and the tendencies of the enemy, and concluding that the Aruna Pass, for all its dangers, offered the best chance of achieving the decisive, overwhelming, psychologically devastating victory that the situation demanded. Thutmose chose the Aruna Pass. The decision was delivered with a calmness and a finality that left no room for further debate. The pharaoh had made his judgment, and the pharaoh's judgment was, by the theology of kingship, the judgment of the gods. The generals, recognizing the authority behind the words and the conviction in the pharaoh's voice, fell silent. The army prepared to march. The decision was either the act of a strategic genius or the gamble of a madman, and the fact that we are still debating which, 34 centuries later, is itself a measure of the man's significance. Because Thutmose was right, brilliantly, audaciously, historically right. The enemy had not fortified the pass. The Egyptian army emerged from the mountain defile onto the plain of Megiddo with its forces intact, its flanks secure, and its enemy caught completely off guard, deployed to cover the 2 wide roads, and utterly unprepared for an attack from the direction that no sane commander would have chosen. The battle that followed, fought on the plain before the city walls, was a decisive Egyptian victory. The coalition army broke. The defenders fled behind the walls of Megiddo, and the young pharaoh, who had spent the first 22 years of his reign in the shadow of his stepmother Hatshepsut, the woman who had made herself king, who had ruled Egypt for 2 decades while the legitimate pharaoh waited, trained, and watched, emerged in a single morning of blood and bronze as the most dangerous military commander the ancient world had ever seen. The Battle of Megiddo, fought in approximately 1457 BC, is the first battle in recorded human history for which we have a detailed tactical account, the first engagement in the long, bloody, endlessly repeated story of human warfare that was documented with enough precision and enough detail for later generations to reconstruct the tactical decisions, the strategic context, and the operational execution that determined its outcome. The annals carved on the walls of the Temple of Amun at Karnak, dictated by the royal scribe Cheneni, who accompanied the campaign and kept a leather-scrolled diary of events, described the approach march, the war council, the deployment of forces, the course of the battle, and the aftermath with a precision that would not be matched until the Greek historians of the 5th century BC. The role of the scribe Chanini in preserving this record cannot be overstated. Chanini accompanied the pharaoh on campaign, recording events in real time on a leather scroll that served as his working diary. The diary was later transcribed, with embellishments and theological additions that the official context of the temple required, onto the walls of Karnak, where it became part of the sacred record of the pharaoh's achievements. The transition from field diary to temple inscription involved a process of selection and elaboration. The raw facts of the campaign were shaped into a narrative that served both historical and theological purposes, documenting the pharaoh's military achievements while simultaneously affirming the divine support that had made those achievements possible. But the underlying factual content, the dates, the locations, the tactical decisions, the inventories of booty, retains a precision that marks the annals as a uniquely reliable source of historical information. It is, in effect, the first piece of military journalism in human history, a detailed, day-by-day account of a military campaign written by an eyewitness who understood both the strategic decisions and the tactical execution that made the victory possible. But Megiddo was only the beginning. Over the next 20 years, Thutmose III would conduct at least 17 military campaigns in the Levant and Nubia, campaigns that expanded the Egyptian empire to its greatest territorial extent, from the Fifth Cataract of the Nile in the south to the banks of the Euphrates in the north, encompassing a territory that was larger, more diverse, and more administratively complex than any empire the ancient world had yet produced. A territory that encompassed deserts and mountains and river valleys and coastlines, that included peoples who spoke a dozen different languages and worshipped 100 different gods, and that was held together not by cultural homogeneity or geographical unity, but by the military power, the administrative skill, and the personal authority of a single man. He would capture 350 cities. He would defeat the kingdom of Mitanni, the most powerful rival Egypt had ever faced. He would cross the Euphrates, placing his own boundary stela beside his grandfather's, in a gesture of dynastic continuity that announced to the world that the Thutmose Empire was not a temporary achievement, but a permanent fact. He would record not a single defeat. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand how a man who spent the first 2 decades of his reign as a figurehead became the greatest and most consistently successful military commander the ancient world had ever produced or would ever produce. You are going to understand the campaigns that built the Egyptian empire, the administrative system that sustained it, and the personality of the man who conceived and executed both. You are going to understand the relationship between Thutmose III and the woman who had kept him from power, Hatshepsut, his stepmother, his co-regent, and the most powerful woman in the ancient world, and why his treatment of her memory after her death tells us as much about him as any battlefield victory. And you are going to understand what it means, in the annals of human history, to be called unstoppable. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let's begin. Thutmose III was born into a world that was not made for him. He was the son of Thutmose II, the pharaoh who had maintained his father's empire during a brief and poorly documented reign, and of a secondary wife named Set, a woman of no particular distinction, whose royal titles were modest, and whose place in the dynastic hierarchy was far below that of the great royal wife. The boy who would become the greatest warrior pharaoh in Egyptian history was not the son of the principal queen. He was not the product of the primary royal union. He was, in the language of modern succession politics, the backup plan, the heir who would never have reached the throne if the preferred candidates had survived. But they had not survived. Thutmose II had died suddenly, unexpectedly, leaving behind a very young son, perhaps 2 or 3 years old, and a formidable widow. The widow was Hatshepsut, daughter of Thutmose I, wife of Thutmose II, and the woman whose royal blood was more legitimate than any living male's. The child who had inherited the throne was technically the pharaoh, But a child of 2 or 3 cannot govern an empire, he cannot command armies, he cannot adjudicate disputes, manage diplomatic relationships, or maintain the complex administrative machinery that sustained the most powerful state in the ancient world. A regent was needed, and the regent was Hatshepsut. The political situation was unprecedented and deeply unstable. The Egyptian state had experienced regencies before, periods in which a queen mother or a senior official governed on behalf of a child king until the king reached maturity. But the regency of Hatshepsut was different in both degree and kind. Hatshepsut was not merely a regent holding the throne in trust. She was a woman of extraordinary ability and ambition, the daughter of the most successful warrior pharaoh in Egyptian history, and the holder of a royal bloodline that was, in the Egyptian theological system, more legitimate than that of the child she was supposed to be serving. The tension between her role as regent, a temporary, subordinate position, and her status as the most legitimate royal figure alive, a position that implied permanent, supreme authority, would define the first 7 years of Thutmose III's reign, and would ultimately resolve itself in the most radical political transformation the pharaonic system had ever experienced. The regency began conventionally enough. Hatshepsut governed in the name of the young Thutmose III, performing the administrative and ceremonial functions that the child king could not. She held the title of regent, a recognized and respectable position in Egyptian political tradition, one that had been occupied by other royal women during earlier periods of dynastic transition. But within approximately 7 years, the exact chronology is debated, something unprecedented happened. Hatshepsut did not simply govern as regent. She had herself crowned as pharaoh, adopting the full royal titulary, wearing the regalia of kingship, including the double crown and the false beard, and presenting herself in the inscriptions and the relief sculptures of her monuments as a king, in every sense of the word. The boy king Thutmose III remained on the throne as co-ruler, but the co-rulership was a fiction. Hatshepsut was the dominant king. Thutmose was the subordinate, the junior partner, the pharaoh-in-waiting, whose actual authority was negligible. The 22 years that Thutmose III spent under Hatshepsut's shadow are among the most tantalizing blanks in the history of the ancient world. What was he doing during those 2 decades? The sources are frustratingly silent. There are hints, scattered references in later inscriptions that suggest he was being trained in military affairs, that he served in some capacity with the Egyptian army, that he was acquiring the skills and the knowledge that would make him, once Hatshepsut died and he finally assumed sole power, one of the most effective commanders in the history of warfare. The silence of the sources during this period is itself significant and deeply frustrating. We know that Thutmose held the title of pharaoh throughout Hatshepsut's reign. We know that his name appeared on certain official documents. We know that he was depicted in some relief sculptures, usually in a subordinate position to Hatshepsut. We know that he was not imprisoned, not exiled, not physically removed from the court. But beyond these bare facts, the sources tell us almost nothing about what the young pharaoh was doing during the most formative years of his life. He is present in the record, but he is a shadow, a silhouette, a figure defined by the absence of information rather than its presence. Some scholars have suggested that Thutmose was deliberately marginalized by Hatshepsut, kept away from the centers of power, excluded from significant decision-making, reduced to a ceremonial figurehead whose presence on the official monuments served to legitimize Hatshepsut's rule without threatening it. Other scholars have argued that the relationship was more cooperative, that Hatshepsut recognized Thutmose's military talent and deliberately cultivated it, training him in the arts of war while she managed the arts of peace, preparing him for the role that he would eventually assume. The truth is that we do not know, and perhaps cannot know, what the relationship between Hatshepsut and Thutmose III was actually like. The sources that survive from Hatshepsut's reign were produced by her court and reflect her perspective. The sources that survive from Thutmose III's reign were produced by his court and reflect his perspective. Neither perspective is neutral. Both are shaped by political calculations that are difficult to disentangle from the underlying historical reality. The most intriguing piece of evidence comes from later inscriptions that describe Thutmose I as having served in the temple of Amun at Karnak during his youth, possibly as a priest, possibly as an acolyte, possibly in some administrative capacity. If this is accurate, it suggests that Hatshepsut may have placed the young pharaoh in the one institution that could have provided him with both a cover story for his political marginalization and a genuine education in the workings of the Egyptian state. The Temple of Amun at Karnak was not merely a religious institution, it was the administrative and economic center of the Theban region, a vast complex of storerooms, workshops, estates, and offices that managed a significant portion of the Egyptian economy. A young man who served in the temple would have learned how the Egyptian administrative system functioned, how resources were mobilized and distributed, how diplomatic correspondence was conducted, and how the relationship between the secular authority of the pharaoh and the religious authority of the priesthood was managed. If Hatshepsut placed Thutmose in the temple, she may have, intentionally or not, given him the education that would make him one of the most effective administrators in Egyptian history. What we can say with confidence is that Thutmose III emerged from the period of Hatshepsut's dominance not as a broken, resentful non-entity, but as a fully formed military leader, a man who had spent 20 years preparing for a moment that might never have come and who, when it did come, was ready. The question of what Thutmose did during those 22 years has another dimension that is rarely discussed, the question of what he felt. The Egyptian sources do not record the pharaoh's emotions. The inscriptions are formulaic, the relief sculptures are conventional, and the administrative documents are impersonal. But the human reality behind the sources must have been intense. Imagine a young man, intelligent, capable, aware of his own abilities, watching year after year as another person exercises the authority that he believes is his by right. Imagine the daily rituals of subordination, the public ceremonies in which Hatshepsut appears as the dominant king and Thutmose as the junior partner, the diplomatic receptions in which foreign ambassadors address their communications to Hatshepsut rather than to Thutmose, the temple inscriptions in which Hatshepsut's name and image take precedence over his. Imagine the private calculations, the conversations with trusted advisors about when and how the situation might change, the assessment of risks and opportunities, the awareness that any premature attempt to seize power could result in imprisonment, exile, or death. The emotional burden of the 22-year wait must have been enormous, and the iron discipline required to endure it without breaking, without acting prematurely, without allowing the accumulated frustration of years of subordination to explode into a rash act that could have cost him everything, without acting rashly, without allowing frustration to overwhelm judgment, is itself a testament to the extraordinary self-control that Thutmose would later display on the battlefield. Hatshepsut died in approximately 1458 BC, in the 22nd year of Thutmose III's reign. The cause of her death is unknown. There is no evidence of foul play, no indication that Thutmose had his stepmother murdered, no suggestion that her death was anything other than the natural conclusion of a life that had been, by any measure, extraordinarily full. But her death transformed the political landscape of Egypt. The dominant king was gone, the junior co-ruler was now the sole pharaoh, and the sole pharaoh had an army, a plan, and 20 years of suppressed ambition to unleash on the world. The Egypt that Thutmose inherited as sole ruler was an Egypt at the height of its wealth and cultural sophistication, but an Egypt whose military reputation had suffered from 2 decades of relative inaction. Hatshepsut's reign had been, by most measures, a success. The economy had flourished, trade had expanded, the arts and architecture had reached new heights of elegance and refinement. The temple at Deir el-Bahari, Hatshepsut's masterpiece, was one of the most beautiful buildings in the ancient world, a graceful colonnaded structure set against the cliffs of the Theban West Bank that demonstrated an aesthetic sensibility as refined as anything produced by later civilizations. The famous trading expedition to the land of Punt, a distant territory probably located on the Horn of Africa, that was the source of incense, myrrh, ebony, gold, and exotic animals, had been one of the signature achievements of Hatshepsut's reign. a triumph of maritime logistics and diplomatic initiative that demonstrated Egypt's capacity for long-distance trade, and that brought to the Nile Valley exotic goods that enhanced the prestige of both the pharaoh and the god Amun, to whom they were dedicated, celebrated in the relief sculptures of Deir el-Bahari, with a vividness and a narrative detail that remain among the most vivid artistic achievements of the new kingdom. But the military consequences of Hatshepsut's peaceful foreign policy were real and potentially dangerous. The Levantine vassal states, the city-state rulers who had submitted to Egyptian authority under Thutmose I, and who were expected to pay tribute, provide military contingents, and accept Egyptian oversight of their affairs, had grown accustomed to an Egypt that talked rather than fought, that negotiated rather than invaded, that maintained its influence through economic pressure rather than military force. For the rulers who were inclined to submit, this was welcome. A lighter hand, a less burdensome suzerainty, a more comfortable form of subjugation. But for the rulers who were inclined to resist, for the king of Kadesh, for the Mitanni agents who moved through the Levantine courts, whispering of Egyptian weakness and Mitanni support, Hatshepsut's peaceful posture was an invitation to test, an invitation to push back, an invitation to form the very coalition that would gather at Megiddo and challenge Egyptian authority in the most direct and dangerous way possible. The speed with which Thutmose moved after Hatshepsut's death suggests that the first campaign, the Megiddo campaign, had been planned well in advance. Within months of assuming sole power, the pharaoh had assembled his army, marched it across the Sinai along the military highway known as the Ways of Horus, and arrived at the fortress city of Gaza, the traditional staging point for Egyptian military operations in the Levant. The campaign was not reactive. It was not a response to a sudden crisis or an unexpected rebellion. It was proactive, a carefully planned, meticulously prepared military operation designed to reassert Egyptian authority in the Levant after the 22 years of Hatshepsut's reign, during which Egypt's attention had been focused on trade and diplomacy rather than military conquest. The army that Thutmose led into the Levant was the finest military force in the ancient world, the product of 3 generations of continuous military development since the wars of liberation against the Hyksos. The infantry was organized into companies and battalions, equipped with bronze weapons and composite bows, and trained in the disciplined formations that were the hallmark of New Kingdom warfare. The chariot corps, the elite arm of the Egyptian military, composed of paired charioteers and archers who delivered devastating mobile firepower, was the most sophisticated and most combat-tested chariot force in the Near East. The chariots themselves were marvels of Bronze Age engineering. Lightweight vehicles constructed from imported wood and leather, mounted on 2 wheels with a spoke construction that provided both strength and flexibility, designed for speed and maneuverability rather than mass or armor. Each chariot carried 2 men, a driver who controlled the horses and a warrior who wielded the composite bow, a weapon that could deliver armor-piercing arrows at ranges of up to 200 meters with an accuracy that made it the single most lethal projectile weapon available to any army in the Bronze Age. Near East. The tactical doctrine of the Egyptian chariot corps was based on mobility and firepower, the ability to close rapidly with the enemy, deliver devastating volleys of arrows at close range, and then withdraw before the enemy infantry could respond. The combination of speed, range, and lethality made the Egyptian chariot corps, surpassing even the Mitanni in the quality of its horses, the design of its vehicles, and the skill of its crews. The army also possessed a sophisticated intelligence capability, a network of scouts, spies, and informants who reported on enemy movements, assessed the strength and disposition of hostile forces, and provided the pharaoh with the information he needed to make informed tactical and strategic decisions. The intelligence that Thutmose received before the Battle of Megiddo, intelligence about the disposition of the coalition forces, the strength of the garrison at Megiddo, and the defences of the 3 mountain passes, was the product of this intelligence network, and the quality of the intelligence was a significant factor in Thutmose's decision to take the Aruna Pass. The intelligence network also provided information about the political dynamics of the Levantine city-states, the alliances, the rivalries, the personal ambitions of the individual rulers, that Thutmose used to exploit divisions within the coalition and to offer inducements to those rulers who might be persuaded to defect from the anti-Egyptian alliance. The combination of military force and diplomatic intelligence was one of the hallmarks of Thutmose's approach to imperial warfare, an approach that recognized that battles are won not just on the field but in the corridors of power, where information, influence, and the careful management of relationships are as important as the strength of the army. He did not choose the pass blindly. He chose it on the basis of information. Information that told him the pass was undefended, that the enemy expected him to use the wider roads, and that a rapid advance through the pass would achieve the surprise that was essential to his plan. The logistical apparatus that sustained the army on campaign, the supply depots, the water stations, the pack animals, the administrative staff who managed the complex business of feeding and equipping thousands of men and hundreds of horses across hundreds of kilometers of hostile territory, was the product of decades of institutional learning, refined through the campaigns of Thutmose I and Thutmose II into a system that could support extended operations far from the Nile Valley, with a reliability and an efficiency that were unprecedented in the ancient world. The revolution in Egyptian military capability since the Hyksos period was total. The army that Thutmose III led into the Levant in his 23rd regnal year bore no resemblance to the militia forces that had defended and failed to defend the Middle Kingdom against the Hyksos invasion. It was a professional force, a full-time military establishment, whose members trained year-round, who were recruited from across the Egyptian population, who served for career-length terms, and who constituted a distinct social class with its own culture, its own values, and its own relationship to the pharaonic state. The professionalization of the Egyptian army was one of the most consequential institutional changes in the history of the pharaonic state, a change that transformed Egypt from a defensive, inward-looking kingdom into an aggressive, outward-looking empire, and that created the military instrument that Thutmose III would wield with such devastating effectiveness. But the most important weapon in Thutmose III's arsenal was not the chariot or the composite bow. It was the mind, the will, and the character of the man himself. Thutmose III possessed a rare and extraordinary combination of strategic vision, tactical brilliance, and personal courage that was, as far as the historical record can tell us, virtually unique in the entire military history of the ancient world. He led from the front, a quality that cannot be overstated in the context of Bronze Age warfare, where the personal courage of the commander was not merely admirable but essential. In an era before telecommunications, before radios, before any means of coordinating military operations other than visual signals and messenger runners, the presence of the commander at the front of the army was the primary mechanism of command and control. The soldiers needed to see the pharaoh. They needed to know that he was there, charging into the enemy lines, risking his own life alongside theirs, sharing the danger and the exhaustion and the terror of combat. Thutmose understood this instinctively, and he exploited it ruthlessly, personally commanding his chariot in battle, personally leading the charge against enemy positions, personally assuming the risks that his soldiers assumed. He made decisions with a speed and a decisiveness that caught his enemies off guard, choosing the Aruna Pass when his generals recommended caution, attacking at dawn when the enemy expected delay, pressing the pursuit when conventional wisdom counseled consolidation. And he maintained, throughout his campaigns, a level of strategic consistency that gave his individual tactical decisions their cumulative force, each campaign building on the last, each victory creating the conditions for the next, each year of warfare bringing the Egyptian empire closer to the comprehensive, systematic domination of the Levant and Nubia that was his ultimate objective. The Egyptologist James Henry Bristed, whose 1906 study Ancient Records of Egypt remains a foundational text in the field, described Thutmose III as the Napoleon of ancient Egypt and the first great military genius in history. The comparison with Napoleon is instructive. if imperfect. Like Napoleon, Thutmose was a military commander who rose to supreme power after a period of political upheaval. Like Napoleon, he conducted a series of brilliant campaigns that expanded his state's territory to unprecedented dimensions. Like Napoleon, he combined tactical innovation with strategic vision, winning battles through speed, surprise, and the willingness to accept calculated risks that more cautious, more orthodox, and more conventionally minded commanders would have avoided at all costs. And like Napoleon, he left behind a military legacy that shaped the history of his civilization for generations, establishing boundaries, creating institutions, and defining the meaning of empire in ways that his successors could imitate but never surpass. The differences between the two men are as instructive as the similarities. Napoleon was a product of the French Revolution, a man who rose to power through the dissolution of an old order and who built his empire on the ruins of the ancien regime. Thutmose was a product of one of the oldest and most stable political traditions in human history, a man who operated within the framework of the pharaonic system and who expanded the empire not by overthrowing the existing order, but by extending it, pushing it outward into new territories while maintaining the theological, administrative, and institutional structures that had sustained Egyptian civilization for 2 millennia. Napoleon was a revolutionary who destroyed an old order and built his empire on the rubble. Thutmose was a perfectionist and an institutionalist, a man who took an existing system and brought it to its highest possible level of effectiveness. But here is where the comparison breaks down, and where Thutmose's achievement becomes, in some ways, even more remarkable than Napoleon's. Napoleon's empire collapsed within 2 decades of its creation, brought down by military overextension, coalition warfare, and the catastrophic failure of the Russian campaign of 1812. Thutmose's empire endured for centuries, maintained by his son Amenhotep II, refined by his successors through the Amarna period and beyond, and defended by the Ramesside pharaohs until the end of the New Kingdom. The empire that Thutmose built was not a flash of military brilliance, followed by inevitable decline. It was a permanent restructuring of the political, economic, and cultural geography of the entire ancient Near East, a transformation that lasted for 400 years, and that shaped the history of the entire Eastern Mediterranean. The Battle of Megiddo was not merely a military engagement. It was a political statement, a declaration, delivered in bronze and blood, that the era of Hatshepsut's peaceful diplomacy was over, and that the era of Thutmose's imperial aggression had begun. The geopolitical context of the Megiddo campaign is essential to understanding its significance. The coalition that had assembled at Megiddo was not a random collection of rebellious city-states. It was a deliberate challenge to Egyptian authority, organized by the king of Kadesh, backed by the kingdom of Mitanni, and designed to exploit the perception that Egypt's military resolve had weakened during the 2 decades of Hatshepsut's reign. Hatshepsut had been a trader, not a warrior. She had maintained and carefully managed Egyptian influence across the vast and politically complex Levant through diplomatic marriages, gift exchanges, and the steady application of economic pressure. She had not conducted the regular military campaigns that the Levantine vassal states had come to expect from the Egyptian pharaoh. The annual campaigns, the shows of strength, the demonstrations of overwhelming military capability that reminded the Levantine city-state rulers who their master was and what the consequences of disloyalty would be. The result was predictable. The vassal states, sensing weakness, had begun to test the limits of Egyptian authority. The king of Kadesh, the most powerful of the Syrian city-states, and the one with the closest ties to the kingdom of Mitanni, had organized a coalition that brought together more than 300 rulers and their forces at the strategic city of Megiddo. The coalition was unprecedented in its scale, a pan-Levantine alliance that brought together city-states from southern Palestine to northern Syria, from the Mediterranean coast to the inland valleys, in a collective response to what was perceived as an existential threat to their independence. The king of Kadesh had spent years assembling this coalition, cultivating alliances, extracting commitments, and coordinating the movement of forces from dozens of different territories toward a single point of concentration. The sophistication of the diplomatic effort that produced the coalition is itself evidence of the political complexity of the Levantine city-state system, a system in which the rulers were constantly calculating, constantly negotiating, and constantly adjusting their alliances in response to the shifting balance of power among the great states that competed for influence in the region. The choice of Megiddo was itself significant. The city controlled the Via Maris, the great coastal road that connected Egypt to the northern Levant, and its capture would have severed Egypt's primary line of communication with its Levantine vassals. The coalition was not merely a rebellion, it was a strategic threat, an attempt to roll back Egyptian influence in the region and to replace it with Mitanni hegemony. Thutmose understood the stakes. The campaign was not optional. If the coalition at Megiddo was not crushed, the entire structure of Egyptian imperial authority in the Levant, the system of vassal states, tribute networks, and diplomatic relationships that his grandfather, Thutmose I, had established, would collapse. The choice of the Aruna Pass, the narrow, dangerous, militarily reckless mountain defile that his generals had begged him not to use, was the product of this understanding. Speed was essential. Surprise was essential. A frontal assault along one of the wider roads would have given the coalition time to prepare, time to concentrate its forces, time to transform a military engagement into a prolonged siege that would have drained Egyptian resources and emboldened other potential rebels. The Aruna Pass offered the possibility, the risky, dangerous, but exhilarating possibility, of catching the enemy unprepared. The account of the battle, preserved in the Karnak annals, is one of the most vivid military narratives in ancient literature. The Egyptian army marched through the pass in a long column, Thutmose at the head, riding his golden chariot, leading by example in a gesture that was as politically calculated as it was personally courageous. The column emerged from the pass on the plain of Megiddo without opposition. The enemy had deployed its forces to cover the two wider roads, leaving the Aruna approach unguarded. The Egyptians deployed into battle formation on the plain, the pharaoh commanding the centre, with divisions on both flanks, and at dawn the next morning the attack began. The annals describe Thutmose riding in his golden chariot, like Horus, the mighty of Arm, like Montu, lord of Thebes, at the head of his army, leading the charge personally in a display of royal valour that was both militarily effective and politically essential. The pharaoh's personal participation in battle was not merely a convention, it was a theological requirement. The pharaoh was the champion of the gods, the defender of Mat, and his presence at the head of the army was understood to invoke divine protection and to ensure the supernatural support that the Egyptians believed was essential to military success. Thutmose II fulfilled this requirement with an enthusiasm that went far beyond the ceremonial, charging into the enemy lines with a ferocity that left the scribe Chianeni struggling to describe the pharaoh's exploits in sufficiently grandiose terms. The battle was swift and decisive. The Egyptian chariot charge, the devastating combination of speed, firepower, and shock that was the hallmark of New Kingdom warfare, shattered the coalition lines within hours. The enemy forces broke and fled toward the city walls, abandoning their chariots, their weapons, and their camp in a panicked rout that left the plain of Megiddo littered with the debris of a defeated army. The annals record the booty captured at Megiddo in meticulous, almost obsessive detail: 924 chariots captured, 202 suits of armor, 2,038 horses, 200 cattle, 20,500 small livestock, and the personal tent of the King of Kadesh, complete with its furnishings. The annals list the booty with a bureaucratic thoroughness that borders on the obsessive. Every item counted, every category enumerated, every contribution to the pharaoh's treasury meticulously recorded. The numbers are striking, not for their size, which is modest by the standards of later campaigns, but for their precision. This is not mythology. This is an inventory, a detailed, itemized accounting of the spoils of war, recorded by a scribe who counted every chariot, every horse, every suit of armor, with the thoroughness of a quartermaster conducting a post-battle audit. But here is the problem, and it is a problem that reveals both Thutmose's greatest strength and his greatest challenge as a commander. The Egyptian soldiers, instead of pursuing the fleeing enemy and preventing them from entering the city, stopped to loot the abandoned camp. The temptation of the plunder, the gold and silver vessels, the bronze weapons and armor, the elaborately decorated chariots, the hundreds of head of livestock, was too great for the discipline of the army to withstand. The fleeing coalition troops were hauled over the walls of Megiddo by their compatriots. Some were pulled up on ropes of clothing lowered from the battlements, and the city's gates were slammed shut before the Egyptians could force their way in. The opportunity for a complete and immediate victory was lost. The battle that should have ended in a single morning became a siege that lasted 7 months. And it gets worse, or rather, it gets more revealing, because the 7-month siege of Megiddo, frustrating as it must have been for Thutmose, demonstrates the other dimension of his military genius, the dimension that separates the merely brilliant tactician from the truly great commander. Thutmose did not abandon the siege. He did not accept a negotiated settlement that would have left the coalition intact. He did not withdraw to Egypt and declare the campaign a success on the basis of the battlefield victory. He stayed. He demonstrated the quality that separates the tactical genius from the strategically great commander, the willingness to endure tedium in the service of a strategic objective. He built a circumvallation, a wall of siege works around the city, and he waited. For 7 months, from approximately May to December of his 23rd regnal year, he starved Megiddo into submission. The siege was not merely a matter of waiting. It was an active military operation, a systematic campaign of strangulation that cut off every avenue of supply and every route of escape. Thutmose constructed a circumvallation, a wall of earth, timber, and brush that completely encircled the city, and he stationed troops along its entire length to prevent any attempt at a breakout or a relief operation. He destroyed the crops in the surrounding fields, denied access to the local water sources, and intercepted any caravans that attempted to bring food or supplies to the besieged city. The siege was methodical, thorough, and relentless, the work of a commander who had learned, perhaps during those 22 years of patient observation, that the most important quality in warfare is not speed or brilliance, but perseverance. The willingness to stay the course, to endure the tedium and the frustration and the logistical strain of a prolonged operation, in the service of a strategic objective that justifies the cost. Thutmose understood that the purpose of a siege is not merely to prevent the enemy from leaving, but to make the enemy's position so untenable that surrender becomes the only rational option, methodically cutting off every supply line, every escape route, every avenue of relief. The city fell, the coalition rulers surrendered, and the lesson, the unmistakable, undeniable, terrifying lesson, was that Thutmose III would never ever give up. That once the pharaoh's army appeared on the horizon, the only question was not whether you would submit, but how much you would suffer before you did. The fall of Megiddo sent shockwaves across the entire Levant, a seismic event that reconfigured the political landscape of the region in a single stroke. The 300 city-states that had participated in the coalition, or that had been sympathetic to it, now faced a stark choice: submit to Egyptian authority and pay the tribute that the pharaoh demanded, or resist and face the same fate that had befallen the defenders of Megiddo. 7 months of siege, starvation, and ultimate capitulation. Most chose submission. The calculation was simple. The cost of resistance was higher than the cost of tribute, and the pharaoh who had taken the Aruna Pass and who had besieged Megiddo for 7 months was not a man who would accept half measures. The fall of Megiddo was the foundation on which the entire Egyptian empire in the Levant was built. The 350 cities that Thutmose captured during his subsequent campaigns were not all taken by force. Many of them surrendered at the approach of the Egyptian army, their rulers calculating that submission was preferable to the fate that had befallen Megiddo. The treatment of the defeated coalition rulers reveals another dimension of Thutmose's strategic intelligence, a dimension that is often overlooked in the emphasis on his military prowess. Thutmose did not execute the defeated rulers. He did not enslave their populations. He did not raise their cities. He accepted their submission, reimposed the tribute obligations that they had been evading, extracted hostages, including the sons of the ruling families who were taken to Egypt for education and Egyptianization, and then allowed the rulers to return to their thrones. The leniency was not weakness, it was strategy. A dead ruler is a void, a vacuum that must be filled, a territory that must be governed, a population that must be administered. A living ruler who has submitted, who has seen the power of the Egyptian army, who knows that his sons are hostages in the pharaoh's court, and who understands that rebellion will bring the army back. That ruler is an asset, a local administrator who governs on the pharaoh's behalf, a manager of a territory that the pharaoh does not need to manage himself. Thutmose understood that the cheapest garrison is a grateful vassal, and that the most effective form of imperial control is one that makes the conquered feel that submission is in their own interest. The reputation that Thutmose established in that first campaign, the reputation of a commander who was tactically brilliant, strategically relentless, and personally fearless, was itself a strategic asset, a weapon as powerful as the chariot corps and as effective as the composite bow. The fear of Thutmose was, for many of the Levantine city-states, sufficient reason to pay tribute, send hostages, and accept the subordination that Egyptian imperial authority demanded. But Thutmose did not rely on fear alone. He was also a builder, a creator of institutions that gave the empire a stability and a durability that mere military force could never have achieved. The system that he developed for governing the Levantine territories was one of the most sophisticated administrative structures in the ancient world. A system that balanced military force with diplomatic flexibility, central authority with local autonomy, and the extraction of tribute with the provision of security. The system was designed to maximize Egyptian control while minimizing Egyptian cost, to create a network of dependent states that governed themselves according to their own traditions while serving Egyptian interests through the regular payment of tribute, the provision of military contingents when requested, and the acceptance of Egyptian oversight in matters of foreign policy and interstate relations. The vassal states retained their local rulers, kings and princes who governed their own peoples according to their own traditions, but those rulers were now bound to the pharaoh by ties of tribute, loyalty, and the constant awareness that the Egyptian army could return at any moment. The garrison system that supported the vassal network was itself an impressive military achievement. Egyptian soldiers were stationed at strategic points throughout the Levant, at major crossroads, at mountain passes, at port cities, and at the administrative centers where the Egyptian commissioners who oversaw the vassal states conducted their business. The garrisons were not large. The Egyptian army did not have the manpower to maintain permanent forces at every point in the empire, but they were strategically placed, designed to provide a rapid response capability that could reinforce the authority of the vassal rulers and suppress minor disturbances before they escalated into major rebellions. The garrison towns also served as supply depots, intelligence collection points, and administrative hubs that connected the local authorities to the central government in Thebes. The system, a masterpiece of imperial engineering that balanced military capability with administrative economy, was efficient, cost-effective, and remarkably durable. It continued to function, with modifications, for centuries after Thutmose's death. The most innovative element of Thutmose's imperial system was his policy of taking the sons of defeated rulers as hostages. The sons were brought to Egypt, where they were raised in the Egyptian court, educated in Egyptian language and culture, and trained in the expectations and the obligations of Egyptian vassalage. When their fathers died, these Egyptianized princes were returned to their home cities to assume their thrones, carrying with them not just a political allegiance to the pharaoh, but a cultural identification with Egypt that made rebellion both personally distasteful and practically difficult. The policy was brilliantly conceived. It transformed potential enemies into loyal allies, created a generation of Levantine rulers who spoke Egyptian, understood Egyptian customs, and felt a personal connection to the Egyptian court that made them, in many cases, genuinely enthusiastic supporters of Egyptian authority rather than merely reluctant subjects. The sons who returned to their home cities after years in the Egyptian court were, in effect, cultural ambassadors, men who had been shaped by Egyptian education, who had formed friendships with Egyptian officials, and who brought with them to their thrones a perspective that was, in crucial respects, more Egyptian than Levantine. The policy created a class of Levantine rulers who understood Egyptian expectations and were willing to meet them, and built a network of personal relationships between the pharaoh's court and the vassal states that was far more durable than any military garrison. The economic dimensions of the empire are recorded in extraordinary detail in the annals, detail that provides modern historians with an unparalleled window into the material culture and the economic organization of the Bronze Age Near East. The annals carved on the walls of Karnak record the tribute that flowed to Egypt from the conquered territories, and the quantities are staggering. Gold, silver, copper, tin, lapis lazuli, turquoise timber, grain, wine, oil, cattle, horses, slaves, and an extraordinary array of luxury goods. Carved ivory, inlaid furniture, decorated vessels of gold and silver, bolts of dyed cloth, jars of precious oils and ointments, cages of exotic birds and animals that filled the storerooms of the Egyptian temples and palaces with the wealth of the known world. The empire that Thutmose built was not merely a military achievement. It was not merely the product of tactical brilliance and strategic vision deployed across 2 decades of continuous warfare. It was an economic system, a vast network of extraction and distribution that channeled the resources of the entire Eastern Mediterranean into the Egyptian treasury, funding the building programs that transformed the temples of Karnak and Luxor into the most magnificent religious complexes in the ancient world, the military campaigns that maintained and expanded the empire's frontiers, and the religious establishments that employed thousands of priests and support staff, and that constituted, in their collective economic activity, one of the largest institutional structures in the Bronze Age that were the visible expressions of Egyptian imperial power. The administrative correspondence that has survived from the Amarna period, roughly a century after Thutmose's death, provides a detailed picture of how the vassal system functioned in practice. The Amarna letters, written by the vassal rulers to the pharaoh and discovered in 1887 at Akhenaten's abandoned capital, show a system of intense, continuous, often contentious communication between the Egyptian court and its Levantine dependents. The vassal rulers wrote to the pharaoh requesting military assistance, complaining about the encroachments of their neighbours, protesting their innocence of alleged disloyalty, and pleading for the pharaoh's personal attention to disputes that the local Egyptian representatives could not resolve. The picture that emerges is one of a complex, high-maintenance system that required constant attention, constant adjustment, and constant readiness to deploy military force to maintain its stability. The system that Thutmose created was not self-sustaining. It was sustained by the continuous exertion of pharaonic authority that, in Thutmose's time, was backed by the personal presence of the pharaoh and his army on annual campaign. The question that the Amarna letters pose, the question that haunts the later history of the New Kingdom, is what happens when the pharaoh stops campaigning? What happens when the annual display of force ceases? When the tribute payments become irregular? When the vassal rulers begin to sense that the pharaoh's attention has wandered? When the Mitanni or the Hittites begin offering alternative patronage to the discontented? The answer, as the Amarna period would demonstrate, is that the system begins to fray. Slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, but with a momentum that becomes increasingly difficult to reverse. The vassal system that Thutmose created was brilliant in its conception and effective in its execution, but it was also fragile, dependent on the continuous application of military and diplomatic pressure that only a pharaoh of Thutmose's energy and competence could sustain. But here is what makes this truly terrifying. Not for the people of the ancient world, but for anyone who studies the nature of power and its consequences. The system worked. It worked for centuries. The imperial structure that Thutmose III created, the vassal system, the hostage policy, the tribute networks, the garrison towns, the diplomatic protocols, sustained the Egyptian empire through the Amarna period, through the upheavals of the late 18th dynasty, through the rise and fall of the 19th dynasty and into the 20th dynasty, when the Sea Peoples and the general collapse of the Bronze Age international system finally brought it down. The empire lasted approximately 400 years, longer than the Roman Empire in the West, longer than the British Empire, longer than any European colonial empire. And the architect of that empire, the man who designed its structure, established its boundaries, and set its tone, was a single individual, Thutmose III, the extraordinary pharaoh who waited 22 years for his chance at power, and who, when that chance came, seized it with a ferocity and a brilliance that the ancient world had never seen. The 17 campaigns of Thutmose III are recorded in the annals at Karnak with varying degrees of detail. The first campaign, the Megiddo campaign, receiving by far the most elaborate treatment, while the later campaigns are often reduced to brief summaries of tribute received and city submitted. But taken together, the campaigns constitute one of the most extraordinary sustained military achievements in the history of the ancient world, a 20-year program of systematic conquest, consolidation, and imperial expansion that transformed the political landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean and established Egypt as the dominant power in the region for centuries to come. Let us follow Thutmose through the most significant of these campaigns, and in doing so, let us trace the arc of an empire being built, city by city, campaign by campaign, year by year. The second and third campaigns, conducted in the years following Megiddo, were essentially consolidation operations. Thutmose returned to the Levant to collect tribute from the cities that had submitted after Megiddo, to reinforce the garrisons he had established, and to remind the vassal rulers that the pharaoh's attention had not wandered. These campaigns were not dramatic. They involved little fighting and produced no great battles, but they were essential to the functioning of the imperial system. An empire is not built by winning battles alone. It is built by the tedious, unglamorous, absolutely necessary work of returning, year after year, to the conquered territories to collect the tribute, inspect the garrisons, adjudicate the disputes, and demonstrate, through the physical presence of the pharaoh and his army, that the imperial authority is permanent, not temporary, and that the consequences of rebellion are not merely possible but certain. The campaigns of the following years demonstrate the systematic, methodical, step-by-step approach that characterized Thutmose's strategic thinking. Each campaign extended the frontier slightly, consolidated the gains of the previous year, and prepared the ground for the next advance. There was no recklessness, no overextension, no attempt to accomplish in a single campaign what could only be achieved through years of patient, incremental progress. Thutmose understood, as few military commanders have understood before or since, that the construction of a durable empire is not a sprint, but a marathon, and that the key to success is not the brilliance of any single campaign, but the consistency and the persistence with which the overall strategic objective is pursued across years and decades. The fourth and fifth campaigns pushed deeper into Syria, taking Egyptian forces into territories that had not previously been under direct Egyptian control. Thutmose's army moved along the coast, securing the Phoenician port cities, Byblos, Sidon, Tyre, that were the commercial hubs of the eastern Mediterranean, and that controlled the maritime trade routes that connected Egypt to the Aegean, to Anatolia, and to the wider world. The capture of these port cities was strategically vital. It gave Egypt control of the sea lanes that sustained the international trade networks of the Bronze Age, and denied the kingdom of Mitanni access to the Mediterranean coast. The Phoenician cities were wealthy, sophisticated, and commercially essential. Their submission to Egyptian authority brought not just tribute, but access to the naval capabilities and the commercial networks that the Egyptians would use to project power across the entire eastern Mediterranean. The incorporation of the Phoenician cities into the Egyptian imperial system was one of Thutmose's most strategically significant achievements. More important, in some ways, than the dramatic battlefield victories that dominate the popular imagination. The Phoenicians were the premier maritime people of the ancient world, shipbuilders, navigators, and traders whose commercial networks connected the entire Mediterranean basin. By bringing them under Egyptian control, Thutmose gained access to a naval and commercial capability that no previous Egyptian pharaoh had possessed. Egyptian influence, which had previously been limited to the land routes of the Levant and the Nile Valley, now extended across the sea, to Cyprus, to Crete, to the Aegean Islands, and to the coastal cities of Anatolia. The Mediterranean, which had been a barrier, became a highway, and the pharaoh who controlled the highway controlled the commerce that sustained the entire Bronze Age international system. The sixth campaign, conducted in approximately year 29 of Thutmose's reign, was one of the most ambitious military operations of the ancient world. Thutmose's army marched northward through the Levant, past the territories that had been secured in previous campaigns, into the heartland of Syria. The target was the city of Kadesh, the same city whose king had organized the coalition at Megiddo, the same city that served as the northern anchor of anti-Egyptian resistance in the region. Kadesh was strategically vital, one of the most important cities in the ancient Near East, a city whose significance would persist for centuries, eventually becoming the site of the famous battle between Ramesses II and the Hittite Empire approximately 200 years later. It controlled the Orontes Valley, the main overland route between the Mediterranean coast and the upper Euphrates, and its capture would sever the connection between the Levantine city-states and their Mitanni patrons. The campaign was successful, Kadesh was taken, and the Egyptian frontier was pushed deeper into Syria than ever before. The capture of Kadesh was a turning point, not just in the military history of the 18th dynasty, but in the strategic geography of the ancient Near East. With Kadesh under Egyptian control, the entire Orontes Valley, the principal north-south corridor of inland Syria, was in Egyptian hands. The Mitanni, whose influence in the region had depended on their ability to project power westward through the Orontes Valley to the Mediterranean coast, were now cut off from their Levantine clients. The strategic encirclement was nearly complete. The seventh campaign, possibly involving naval operations along the Phoenician coast, further consolidated Egyptian control of the maritime dimension of the Levantine theatre. Thutmose understood that the eastern Mediterranean was not merely a body of water separating Egypt from the lands to the north. It was a highway, a commercial and military artery that connected the Phoenician port cities, the Egyptian delta, the Aegean Islands, and the coast of Anatolia in a network of trade routes that sustained the entire economy of the Bronze Age. Control of these trade routes, which meant control of the port cities that served as their nodes, was as strategically important as control of the overland routes that connected the Levantine interior to the Euphrates Valley. But the culmination of Thutmose's Levantine campaigns, the campaign that established his reputation as the greatest warrior pharaoh in Egyptian history, was the eighth campaign, conducted in approximately year 33 of his reign. This was the Euphrates campaign, the march to the great river that his grandfather Thutmose I had reached half a century earlier, and that had become, in the Egyptian imagination, the symbol of the farthest limit of pharaonic ambition. Thutmose's objective was not merely to reach the Euphrates. His grandfather had already done that. His objective was to cross it, to take the war to the kingdom of Mitanni on its own territory, to shatter the power that had been supporting anti-Egyptian resistance in the Levant for decades, and to establish, beyond any possibility of doubt, that Egypt was the supreme power in the ancient Near East. The logistical challenge was immense. The Euphrates lies more than 1,000 kilometers from the Nile Valley, a distance that required weeks of marching through hostile territory, across deserts, over mountains, and through a political landscape that was unstable, unpredictable, and potentially dangerous at every point. But Thutmose had been preparing for this campaign for years, building supply depots along the route, securing the loyalty of the coastal cities that would serve as his forward bases, and constructing boats that were carried overland on ox carts for the river crossing. The scale of the preparation was enormous. The campaign required the coordination of multiple supply chains: food for the soldiers, fodder for the horses, arrows for the archers, replacement parts for the chariots, water for the march through the Syrian interior, across a distance of more than 1,000 kilometers from the Nile Valley. The boats that were built for the river crossing were probably made of cedar, the light, strong, rot-resistant wood of the Lebanese mountains that had been the preferred shipbuilding material of the ancient Near East for millennia. They were constructed in sections at the shipyards of Byblos, the great Phoenician port city that had been a center of maritime commerce since the 3rd millennium BC, and that had been under Egyptian influence, with interruptions since the Old Kingdom. The boats, built in the port city of Byblos, transported across hundreds of kilometers of rough terrain and launched on the Euphrates for the crossing, are one of the most remarkable logistical achievements of the ancient world. No previous Egyptian army had ever attempted anything as logistically ambitious as transporting boats overland for a contested river crossing in hostile territory. The innovation demonstrates both the scale of Thutmose's ambition and the depth of his logistical planning. The crossing of the Euphrates was successful. Thutmose's army engaged and defeated the forces of Mitanni on the far bank of the river, pushing deep into Mitanni territory, burning villages, seizing livestock, and capturing prisoners in a campaign of devastation that was designed to demonstrate to the Mitanni king and to the entire ancient world that the pharaoh's reach extended beyond the river that had once been the limit of Egyptian power. Thutmose erected his boundary stela beside his grandfather's, the gesture of dynastic continuity that announced the permanence of the Egyptian claim. The campaign across the Euphrates was not merely a military operation, it was a psychological blow, a demonstration that the Mitanni heartland, which the Mitanni kings had believed was protected by the river barrier, was vulnerable to Egyptian attack. The crossing shattered the illusion of Mitanni invincibility and demonstrated that the pharaoh's reach extended beyond any geographical barrier that the Near East could provide. The Mitanni would never fully recover from the shock. Within a century, the kingdom would decline into a secondary power, squeezed between the rising Hittite Empire to the north and the resurgent Assyrian state to the east. Its glory days, as Egypt's principal rival, a fading memory preserved only in the diplomatic correspondence of the Amarna period. Thutmose then turned his army southward, back toward the Levant and the long march home. The return march from the Euphrates was itself a remarkable achievement of logistics and endurance. The army had to retrace its route across hundreds of kilometers of Syrian territory that was now, in theory, under Egyptian control but that remained potentially hostile, populated by peoples who had been defeated but not necessarily reconciled to Egyptian authority. The march was punctuated by moments of both danger and triumph. The army engaged scattered pockets of resistance, collected tribute from recently subdued city-states, and demonstrated, through its continued presence and its continued combat effectiveness, that the Egyptian imperial commitment to the region was permanent. On the return march, one of the most famous episodes of Thutmose's career occurred, the elephant hunt at Ni. The region around the Syrian city of Ni was home to a population of wild elephants, a subspecies of the Asian elephant that inhabited the forests and marshlands of northern Syria, and that was prized for its ivory. The Syrian elephant, a now extinct subspecies that was smaller than both the modern African and Asian elephants but still formidable, represented both a resource and a spectacle. Its ivory was prized throughout the ancient world, and control of the elephant hunting grounds was an economic advantage. But the hunt was also a political performance, a display of royal prowess and personal courage that was designed to demonstrate to the soldiers who accompanied the pharaoh and to the foreign rulers who heard the stories that the Egyptian pharaoh was not a distant bureaucrat directing operations from behind the lines, but a warrior who confronted physical danger with the same courage he displayed on the battlefield. Thutmose hunted these elephants personally, an activity that was both a display of royal prowess and a practical exercise in resource extraction. The hunt was dangerous. One of Thutmose's soldiers, a veteran named Ahmose I, later recorded in his tomb autobiography that he had saved the pharaoh's life during the hunt by cutting off the trunk of an attacking elephant. The autobiography of Ahmose I is one of the most remarkable documents of the New Kingdom, a personal narrative that provides a ground-level view of Thutmose's campaigns, complementing the official annals at Karnak with the perspective of a common soldier who served in the pharaoh's personal guard. Amenemhab records not only the elephant hunt, but also his participation in multiple campaigns, his acts of bravery in battle, and the rewards he received from the pharaoh for his service. His account of the elephant hunt is particularly vivid. He describes the charging elephant, the danger to the pharaoh, and his own intervention with a specificity that suggests genuine memory rather than conventional formulae. The story, vivid, personal, and surprisingly intimate, gives us a glimpse of the man behind the monuments, a pharaoh who led from the front, who took personal risks, who inspired loyalty in the men who served him, and who was not above being saved by a quick-thinking soldier with a blade. The annals at Karnak also record something that no other pharaoh's military records include, and that reveals a dimension of Thutmose's personality that is as striking as his military genius. Alongside the lists of captured cities, the inventories of tribute, and the accounts of battles won, the annals include descriptions of the plants and animals that Thutmose encountered during his campaigns, species that he collected and brought back to Egypt, where they were planted in a garden attached to the temple of Amun at Karnak. The Botanical Garden at Karnak, a room decorated with carved relief representations of 275 different plant species from the Levant, is one of the most unusual monuments in the history of ancient art. It is in effect a scientific catalogue, a systematic record of the flora of the conquered territories, depicted with an accuracy and an attention to botanical detail that would not be matched until the botanical illustrations of the European Enlightenment, 3,000 years later. The garden is also a statement about the nature of empire, a declaration that the pharaoh's authority extends not just over people and territory, but over the natural world itself, that the conquered lands have been not just subjugated, but catalogued, their resources not just extracted, but understood. Thutmose was not merely a conqueror. He was a collector, a man who looked at the foreign lands he had invaded and saw, beyond their military and economic value, their biological richness, their ecological diversity, their scientific interest. The pharaoh who painted flowers on the walls of a temple was making a statement as powerful, in its own way, as the pharaoh who listed captured cities, a statement that the empire encompassed not just the political and military landscape of the ancient world, but its natural landscape as well. The pharaoh who conquered 350 cities was also a naturalist. The general who defeated the kingdom of Mitanni was also a collector of plants. The man who waged war for 20 years was also a man who noticed flowers. This is not science fiction. This is the documented, archaeologically attested, inscriptionally recorded reality of a pharaoh who was as intellectually curious as he was militarily brilliant, a man whose interests extended beyond the battlefield to the natural world, to the arts of architecture and design, to the management of complex administrative systems, and to the creation of cultural institutions that would outlast his military achievements by millennia. The Botanical Garden is one of the most unusual monuments in the ancient world, and one of the most revealing. In an era when pharaohs celebrated their achievements through the conventional vocabulary of military triumph, scenes of chariot charges, bound prisoners, and the pharaoh smiting the enemies of Egypt, Thutmose chose to celebrate his achievements through the depiction of plants. Not symbolic plants, not mythological plants, real plants, identifiable species that modern botanists have been able to classify, species that Thutmose brought back from his campaigns and cultivated in an actual garden attached to the temple complex. The garden was a scientific collection, a systematic attempt to catalogue and preserve the flora of the conquered territories, and its existence tells us something about Thutmose that the military annals alone cannot convey, that the pharaoh who conquered the known world, 350 cities, was also a man of intellectual curiosity, a man who looked at the world with the eye of a naturalist, as well as the eye of a general, a man whose interest in the territories he conquered extended beyond their military value and their tribute potential to their biological diversity. The festival hall at Karnak, the Ak menu, built to commemorate Thutmose's said festival or jubilee, is one of the most architecturally innovative buildings of the New Kingdom, with its unique tent-pole columns that evoke the temporary pavilions used during military campaigns. The The hall contains not just the botanical garden, but also relief sculptures depicting the artistic and religious traditions of the conquered peoples. A kind of cultural encyclopedia that suggests the pharaoh's interest in understanding, not just subjugating, the civilizations he had defeated. Let us now consider the later campaigns in more detail, because it is in the sustained, year-after-year prosecution of the imperial project that Thutmose's genius, his unique combination of tactical brilliance, strategic vision, logistical competence, and administrative innovation, becomes most fully apparent. No single campaign, however brilliant, defines a military career. It is the sustained, year-after-year prosecution of a coherent strategic objective that separates the merely talented from the genuinely great. The campaigns after Megiddo were not merely repetitions of the first. They were adaptations, each one calibrated to the specific political and military conditions that prevailed in the region at the time. The seventh campaign, for example, was a naval expedition. The Egyptian army transported by sea to the Phoenician coast, landing behind the defensive positions that the Levantine city-states had established to block an overland advance. The use of naval transport to outflank land-based defences was an innovation that demonstrated Thutmose's ability to think beyond the conventions of chariot warfare and to exploit the full range of military capabilities that Egypt's geographic position, straddling the land bridge between Africa and Asia, with access to both the Mediterranean Sea to the north and the Red Sea to the south, uniquely provided. The 10th campaign was directed against the port city of Ulaza, which had been fortified by the Mitanni as a forward base for operations against Egyptian interests in the region. Thutmose's capture of Ulaza deprived the Mitanni of their last Mediterranean outlet and completed the strategic encirclement that had been the objective of the preceding campaigns. Each campaign built on the last, each one extending the frontier, tightening the net, reducing the options available to the Mitanni and their local allies. The cumulative effect was devastating. By the time of the 8th campaign and the crossing of the Euphrates, the Mitanni kingdom had been pushed back to its core territory in the upper Euphrates valley, cut off from the Mediterranean, deprived of its Levantine allies, and confronted with the reality that the Egyptian Empire was not a temporary phenomenon, but a permanent fixture of the Near Eastern political landscape. The comparison with other great military commanders who were also patrons of the arts and sciences is instructive. Alexander the Great, who is often compared to Thutmose, brought scientists and naturalists on his Asian campaigns and is credited with advancing the geographical and botanical knowledge of the ancient world. Napoleon, the other standard comparison, was accompanied on his Egyptian campaign by a team of savants whose work produced the Description de l'Egypte, one of the foundational documents of modern Egyptology. Both commanders, like Thutmose, combined military genius with intellectual curiosity, a combination that is rarer than either quality alone, and that suggests a mind of unusual range and depth. Thutmose's botanical garden at Karnak is the Bronze Age equivalent of Alexander's geographical surveys and Napoleon's savant expedition, the product of a commander who understood that empire is not merely a matter of military force but of knowledge, of understanding, of the systematic acquisition and organization of information about the world that the empire encompassed. But the comparison must not obscure what is unique about Thutmose's achievement. Neither Alexander nor Napoleon built empires that lasted. Alexander's empire collapsed within a generation of his death. Napoleon's empire collapsed within 2 decades. Thutmose's empire lasted 4 centuries, a fact that is easily stated but almost impossible to fully appreciate. 4 centuries is a longer period than the entire history of the United States of America. It is longer than the period from the English Civil War to the present day. It is longer than the combined duration of the British, French, and Dutch colonial empires in Asia. The Egyptian empire that Thutmose built outlasted not just the empires of Alexander and Napoleon, but virtually every other imperial structure in the ancient world, with the sole exception of the Egyptian state itself. Maintained by a succession of pharaohs who built upon the administrative and military foundations that Thutmose had established, refined the systems that he had created, and defended the territories that he had conquered. The durability of Thutmose's empire is its most remarkable feature, and it is the feature that is most often overlooked by historians who focus on the dramatic battles and the brilliant campaigns, while ignoring the administrative innovations and the institutional structures that gave those victories their lasting significance. The math is striking when you consider the scale of Thutmose's campaigns across 2 decades. 17 campaigns in 20 years, roughly 1 campaign per year, each requiring months of preparation, weeks of marching, and the deployment of thousands of soldiers across hundreds of kilometers of hostile territory. The scale of the military effort is difficult to comprehend from the perspective of the modern world, where armies are transported by aircraft and supplied by mechanized logistics systems. In the 15th century BC, every soldier marched on his own feet. Every horse was fed from grain that had been grown, harvested, transported, and stored by human labor. Every arrow was handcrafted from reed, flint, and feather. Every chariot was assembled from materials sourced from across the ancient world. Timber from Lebanon, leather from Egyptian cattle, bronze from the mines of the Sinai. Every meal was cooked over a fire built from fuel that had been gathered along the route of march. The cumulative logistical effort, the food consumed, the weapons manufactured, the horses bred and trained, the chariots built and maintained, the administrative correspondence generated, the diplomatic relationships managed, was staggering. The Egyptian state that sustained this effort was not merely a military machine. It was an industrial enterprise, a complex, coordinated, administratively sophisticated operation that mobilized the resources of an entire civilization in the service of a single objective: the permanent expansion and consolidation of pharaonic authority across the ancient Near East. And now we arrive at the question that lies beneath all the campaigns and the conquests, and the brilliant tactical decisions and the meticulous administrative innovations. The question that the annals at Karnak do not address, and that the botanical garden at Karnak cannot answer. What does it mean? What does it really, truly, humanly mean to wait 22 years for your life to begin? Thutmose III was technically the pharaoh of Egypt from the day his father died. A child of perhaps 2 or 3 years, placed on the throne of the world's greatest empire by the accident of birth and the mathematics of succession. But he was not the pharaoh in any meaningful sense, not in the sense that mattered, not in the sense that conferred actual authority over the military, the administration, the treasury, and the foreign policy of the Egyptian state and knights. He was a title, a name on a monument, a placeholder in the dynastic sequence. The real power belonged to Hatshepsut, the woman who had married his father, who had served as his regent, who had crowned herself king, and who had governed Egypt with a competence and a confidence that made the fiction of the young Thutmose's authority increasingly transparent with each passing year. For 22 years, from approximately 1479 to 1458 BC, Thutmose III watched another person exercise the power that was, by right of birth and by the theology of kingship, his. Let that sink in. 22 years. That is not a brief period of apprenticeship. It is a generation. The time it takes to grow from infancy to adulthood and beyond. The time it takes to watch your contemporaries assume their responsibilities while you remain, year after year, in a position of nominal authority and actual impotence. Consider what those 22 years meant in practical terms. Thutmose was approximately 2 or 3 years old when he became pharaoh, an infant whose throne name was inscribed on the monuments, but whose actual role in governance was non-existent. By the time Hatshepsut died, he was in his mid-20s, a fully grown man who had spent his entire conscious life in the shadow of a ruler who was not his mother, who occupied a throne that was technically his, and who showed no intention of voluntarily relinquishing power. The psychological impact of this experience, the sense of powerlessness, the frustration of watching another person exercise authority that was rightfully yours, the daily humiliation of occupying a position of nominal supremacy and actual subordination, must have been enormous. And yet the evidence suggests that Thutmose did not allow the experience to embitter him. He did not waste his time in resentment, he used it in preparation. 22 years of watching Hatshepsut build her magnificent temple at Deir el-Bahari commission her obelisks at Karnak, send her trading expedition to Punt, manage the affairs of the empire, and accumulate the monuments and the inscriptions that would, for centuries afterward, define the public memory of the period. 22 years of waiting, 22 years of preparing, 22 years of watching and learning and calculating, acquiring the military skills, the strategic knowledge, and the political awareness that would make him, when the waiting finally ended, the most effective, the most prepared, and the most dangerous ruler the ancient world had ever seen, or would ever see. Let that sink in. The man who would become the greatest military commander in the history of the ancient world spent the first 2 decades of his reign. The years when most pharaohs were establishing their legacies, building their monuments, conducting their first campaigns, and demonstrating to the world that they were worthy of the throne, in the shadows, waiting, watching, preparing for a future that might never have arrived, since Hatshepsut showed no sign of voluntarily relinquishing power, and since her health, as far as the sources can tell us, was robust throughout most of her reign. Thutmose waited, not because he chose to, but because he had no alternative. And the deeper and more consequential question of what he actually did with that enforced, involuntary, and seemingly interminable period of waiting, how he turned constraint into preparation and frustration into fuel, is one of the most fascinating psychological questions in the history of leadership. The experience of enforced waiting, of being denied the exercise of power that one believes is rightfully one's own, has shaped the characters of rulers throughout history. The parallels in world history are instructive, and they illuminate, by contrast, the extraordinary nature of Thutmose's response to his situation. The Roman Emperor Tiberius, who spent years in exile on the island of Rhodes, while Augustus decided whether to make him his heir, emerged from the experience as a suspicious, resentful, and politically paranoid ruler whose reign, though competent, was marked by an undercurrent of bitterness that never fully dissipated. Charles, the Prince of Wales, waited more than 70 years to become King of the United Kingdom, the longest apprenticeship in the history of the British monarchy. And the experience of that interminable waiting inevitably shaped his character, his priorities, his understanding of the institution he would eventually inherit, and his determination to make the most of whatever time remained to him when the waiting finally ended, and his understanding of the institution he eventually inherited. In each case, the experience of enforced patience left its mark, for better or for worse, on the ruler who emerged from it. Thutmose's response to the waiting was neither resentment nor resignation. It was preparation. The evidence suggests, though the evidence is fragmentary and circumstantial, that Thutmose used the years of Hatshepsut's dominance to prepare himself for the role he would eventually assume. He trained with the army. He studied the geography and the politics of the Levant and Nubia. He cultivated relationships with the military officers who would serve as his commanders during the campaigns to come. He observed, from the margins of power, from the periphery of the court, the workings of the Egyptian administrative system, the dynamics of the international diplomatic network, and the strengths and weaknesses of the vassal system that his grandfather had established. When Hatshepsut died, Thutmose was not a neophyte stumbling into power. He was a fully prepared commander, a man who had spent 2 decades studying the game and who, when he was finally allowed to play, played with a skill and a ferocity that stunned the ancient world. There is a particular kind of strength that only suffering can produce, a particular kind of clarity that only comes from having watched, for years, while someone else exercised the power that you believed was yours. Thutmose's military genius was not the product of innate talent alone. It was the product of 22 years of intense, focused, silent preparation. 22 years during which the young pharaoh watched, learned, analyzed, and refined his understanding of the military, diplomatic, and administrative challenges that he would face when his time came. The waiting was not passive. It was the most active kind of preparation imaginable. The intense, focused, minutely detailed preparation of a man who knew with absolute certainty that his entire life would be compressed into the period after the waiting ended, and who was determined to waste not a single moment of it. The annals of history are full of rulers who came to power early and squandered their opportunities, men who inherited thrones as children and who, lacking the preparation that adversity provides, made catastrophic decisions that destroyed their kingdoms and their legacies. Thutmose was the opposite, a man who came to effective power late, who had been forced by circumstances to develop the patience, the judgment, and the strategic discipline that are the rarest qualities in a military commander, and who deployed those hard-won, painstakingly developed qualities when the time finally came, with a devastating, relentless, world-changing effectiveness. The paradox of Thutmose's career is that his greatest weapon was a quality that is usually considered a liability: his patience. In a world that celebrated decisive action, in a civilization that defined the pharaoh as a warrior king, whose duty was to smite the enemies of Egypt and maintain the cosmic order through the exercise of divine force, Thutmose's patience was his most subversive quality. It allowed him to endure what no previous pharaoh had endured. It allowed him to prepare for what no previous pharaoh had prepared for, and it allowed him to accomplish, when the waiting was over, what no previous pharaoh had accomplished that has rarely been equaled in the entire recorded history of human warfare. The closest parallel is perhaps the career of Genghis Khan, another ruler who spent years in political marginalization before emerging to build one of the largest empires in world history. But even the Mongol comparison, while instructive, does not fully capture the uniqueness of Thutmose's achievement. Genghis Khan built an empire through conquest. Thutmose built an empire through conquest and administration, creating not just a territory but a system, not just a dominion but a durable political structure that functioned, with modifications, for 4 centuries after his death. The question of Thutmose's relationship with Hatshepsut, and specifically the question of why he eventually attempted to erase her memory from the monuments of Egypt, is one of the most intensely debated and most emotionally charged topics in all of Egyptology. The erasure is well documented. Late in his reign, perhaps 25 years after Hatshepsut's death, Thutmose ordered a systematic campaign of destruction against Hatshepsut's monuments. Her statues were smashed or buried. Her images were chiseled from the walls of temples. Her cartouches were replaced with those of Thutmose I, Thutmose II, or Thutmose III himself. The erasure was thorough enough that Hatshepsut's name was essentially unknown in Egypt's history until 19th century Egyptologists reconstructed her career from the fragmentary evidence that the destruction had not reached. But the timing of the erasure is significant, and it undermines the simple narrative of personal revenge that has long dominated the popular understanding of Thutmose's relationship with Hatshepsut. If Thutmose hated his stepmother, if he had spent 22 years seething with resentment at the woman who had usurped his throne, then why did he wait 25 years after her death to begin the erasure? If Thutmose had acted immediately upon Hatshepsut's death, if the erasure had begun in year 22 of his reign rather than approximately year 42, the personal revenge interpretation would be more plausible. The fact that he waited 2 decades, during which he was busy conquering the known world, building the annals at Karnak, and establishing the most successful military record of any pharaoh in history, suggests that the erasure of Hatshepsut was not a priority but an afterthought, not an urgent act of vengeance, but a carefully considered and deliberately timed political decision made late in his reign when the question of the succession was becoming pressing. The delay suggests that the motivation was not personal but political, not the product of individual hatred, but the result of a calculated decision about the succession. The erasure campaign coincides roughly with the rise to prominence of Thutmose's son, Amenhotep II, who was being prepared for the throne. The most likely explanation is that Thutmose ordered the erasure not to punish Hatshepsut, but to simplify the dynastic record, to remove the anomaly of a female pharaoh from the sequence of male rulers, to create a clean, unambiguous, theologically conventional line of male succession from Thutmose I through Thutmose II to Thutmose III and onward to Amenhotep II. and to eliminate a precedent that might encourage future women of the royal family to claim the throne for themselves. The explanation is pragmatic rather than emotional, political rather than personal, and it is consistent with what the rest of the evidence tells us about Thutmose's character. He was not a man driven by passion. He was a man driven by calculation, by the cold, clear, analytically precise assessment of strategic options and their consequences that made him such a devastating military commander. The erasure of Hatshepsut was not an act of rage. It was an act of statecraft, a decision made for the stability of the dynasty and the clarity of the succession, executed with the same methodical thoroughness that characterized everything Thutmose did. The erasure also served a theological purpose that is often overlooked in the discussion of Thutmose's motives. The pharaonic system was built on the concept of Mat, the cosmic order that the pharaoh was responsible for maintaining. A female pharaoh, a woman who had adopted the male regalia of kingship, who had presented herself as a king in the inscriptions and the reliefs, who had violated the fundamental assumption that the pharaoh was male, was, from the perspective of Mat, a disruption, not necessarily a harmful one. Hatshepsut's reign had been prosperous and stable, and the gods had apparently not objected to her assumption of male prerogatives, but a disruption nonetheless. By erasing Hatshepsut from the record, Thutmose was not merely simplifying the dynastic sequence. He was restoring the cosmological order, removing an anomaly from the sacred history of the pharaonic institution and presenting, to the gods and to posterity, a seamless, theologically correct, cosmologically reassuring narrative of male succession that conformed to the theological expectations of the Egyptian cosmological system. The irony, of course, is that the erasure failed. Hatshepsut was not permanently forgotten. The 19th century Egyptologists, who reconstructed her career from the fragmentary evidence that the destruction had missed, the partially chiseled inscriptions, the surviving statuary, the architectural evidence of her building programs, succeeded in doing precisely what Thutmose had tried to prevent, restoring a female pharaoh to the historical record. The erasure that was intended to be permanent turned out to be temporary, a reminder that the control of the historical record is never as complete as the controller imagines, and that the truth, however deeply buried, has a tendency to resurface. The lesson applies beyond Egyptology. Every attempt to control the historical record, every effort to shape the narrative, to suppress inconvenient facts, to eliminate the memory of people whose existence challenges the official story, eventually fails. The evidence survives. The traces persist. The stones that were recarved retain, in their surfaces, the ghosts of the original inscriptions. The statues that were buried can be dug up. The names that were chiseled away can be reconstructed from the cartouches that the destroyers missed. The past resists erasure, not always, not completely, but stubbornly, persistently, with a determination that rivals the determination of the erasers themselves. Whether it was the right decision, morally, historically, humanly, is a question that the sources cannot answer and that each observer must decide for themselves. But it was not the act of a petty or vindictive man. The erasure is also, in a sense, the final chapter of the story that began when a 3-year-old boy was placed on the throne of Egypt and told that he was pharaoh, even though the woman who stood behind the throne held the actual power and would hold it for the next 2 decades. The erasure is the adult Thutmose's retrospective correction of a narrative that he had been forced to endure as a child. The rewriting of a history that he had been powerless to shape as it unfolded, but that he was determined to reshape in retrospect. It was not revenge. It was narrative control. The assertion of authorship over a story that had been, for 22 years, written by someone else. It was the act of a ruler who understood that empires are built not on sentiment, but on structure, and that structure sometimes requires the erasure of even the most accomplished predecessor. We have followed Thutmose III from the shadows of Hatshepsut's court to the banks of the Euphrates and back, from the powerless child king to the greatest, the most methodical, and the most consistently victorious military commander of the ancient world. We have seen how 22 years of enforced waiting produced not a broken man, but a sharpened one, a commander whose patience on the margins of power became, in the field, a devastating weapon. We have seen the Battle of Megiddo, the first recorded battle in human history, won through a gamble that defied military orthodoxy and established a reputation that would sustain an empire for 4 centuries. We have seen the 17 campaigns, the 350 captured cities, the crossing of the Euphrates, the defeat of Mitanni, the botanical garden at Karnak, and the creation of an administrative system that was, in its sophistication and its durability, one of the most impressive achievements of any ancient civilization. What does this story mean? Not for the specialists and the scholars and the academic conferences, where the annals of Thutmose III are passed and debated, but for anyone listening to these words in the quiet of the night, but for anyone who has ever waited for something they believed was theirs. It means that waiting is not wasted time. The 22 years that Thutmose I spent under Hatshepsut's shadow were not lost years. They were the years that made everything else possible. Without the waiting, there would have been no preparation. Without the preparation, there would have been no Megiddo. Without Megiddo, there would have been no empire. The man who emerged from Hatshepsut's long and formidable shadow in 1458 BC, the year that Hatshepsut died, and Thutmose I assumed sole power over the most wealthy and most militarily capable state in the ancient world, was not the same man who had entered it as a child. He was a finished product, shaped by adversity, polished by patience, sharpened by 2 decades of the most intensive preparation that any ruler in the ancient world had ever undergone. A commander who had been hardened by patience, sharpened by observation, and educated by the intimate study of power that only the powerless can achieve. The waiting was not the obstacle. It was the forge, the fire that tempered the steel, the pressure that compressed the carbon into diamond. Without the 22 years, there would have been no pharaoh worth remembering. Only another privileged heir who inherited a kingdom and managed it with the mediocre competence that inherited power so often produces. The long, involuntary, seemingly purposeless waiting gave Thutmose something that no amount of privilege or wealth or inherited authority could have provided: the experience of powerlessness, the discipline of patience, and the hunger, the deep, burning, relentless, 22-year hunger, the hunger of a man who had been denied everything that he believed was his by right, and who channeled that denial not into bitterness or resignation, but into the most focused, the most disciplined, the most systematic, and the most astonishingly productive preparation that any ruler in the ancient world had ever undertaken to prove that he was worthy of the throne that had been kept from him. It means that brilliance without patience is nothing. The military genius that Thutmose displayed at Megiddo was not a talent he was born with. It was a skill he had cultivated over decades of study, practice, and observation. The decision to take the Aruna Pass was not a gamble. It was a calculated risk, informed by a deep understanding of the enemy's likely dispositions, the terrain's tactical possibilities, and the Egyptian army's capacity for rapid movement through difficult terrain. Every element of Thutmose's military success, the speed, the decisiveness, the willingness to accept risk, the relentless pursuit of strategic objectives, was the product of the 22 years he had spent preparing for the moment when he would be allowed to exercise the abilities he had been developing in silence. And it means that the nature of power is not what we often imagine it to be. Hatshepsut held the throne for 22 years and built some of the most magnificent monuments in Egyptian history. Thutmose held the throne for 32 years as sole ruler and built one of the most successful empires in the history of the ancient world. Both were remarkable. Both were, in their own ways, extraordinary. The tragedy, if there is a tragedy, is not that one of them ruled and the other did not. It is that the empire required both: the builder and the warrior, the diplomat and the conqueror, the woman who maintained the peace, and the man who won the wars, and that the two of them, constrained by the conventions of their civilization and the expectations of their theology, could not share the throne as equals, could not find a way to harness the genius of both without forcing one to subordinate the other. Hatshepsut was a brilliant administrator, a visionary builder, and a diplomatic strategist whose trading expedition to Punt demonstrated a capacity for international engagement that was as impressive, in its own way, as Thutmose's military campaigns. Thutmose was a military genius, an institutional innovator, and a strategic thinker whose campaigns built an empire that lasted 4 centuries. Together, they might have been the greatest partnership in the history of the ancient world. The builder and the warrior, the diplomat and the general, the woman who opened the trade routes, and the man who defended them. But the pharaonic system, with its insistence on a single divine authority embodied in a single male body, could not accommodate a partnership of equals. One had to rule, the other had to wait. And the civilization that imposed this choice was poorer for it, richer in military glory perhaps, but poorer in the possibility that a different kind of pharaonic system, a more inclusive and more flexible system, might have produced an empire that was not merely powerful but also wise. The thought experiment is purely speculative. The pharaonic system of the 15th century BC was what it was, and the idea that Hatshepsut and Thutmose could have ruled as equals is an anachronism that imposes modern values on an ancient civilization. But the thought experiment is also instructive, because it illuminates the cost of the pharaonic system's rigidity, the price that was paid for the insistence on a single divine authority embodied in a single person, and the possibilities that were foreclosed by a political theology that could not accommodate the sharing of supreme power. The empire endured, the battles were won, the tribute flowed, the annals were carved, the botanical garden was planted, the Euphrates was crossed. But the human cost, the 22 years of waiting, the erasure of Hatshepsut, the forced subordination of genius to convention, remains a reminder that even the greatest civilizations operate within constraints that limit their potential, and that the achievements they produce, however magnificent, are always less than what might have been possible under a different set of rules, but were forced by the rigid, inflexible, theologically mandated logic of the pharaonic system into a relationship of dominance and subordination that diminished them both. The story of Thutmose III is also a story about the relationship between military genius and institutional building, and about the fact that the second is ultimately more important than the first. Military genius wins battles, institutional building wins centuries. Thutmose won both, and the fact that his institutional innovations, the vassal system, the hostage policy, the garrison network, the tribute system, the diplomatic protocols, the administrative correspondence, outlasted his military victories by centuries is the measure of his true significance. The vassal system, the hostage policy, the tribute networks, the garrison structure, the administrative correspondence, the diplomatic protocols, these were not glamorous achievements. They were not the stuff of epic poetry or monumental inscription, but they were the framework on which the empire rested, the invisible infrastructure that sustained the visible grandeur of the pharaonic state. Without them, the military victories would have been meaningless, flashes of brilliance followed by inevitable retreat, like the brilliant but ultimately unsustainable campaigns of Alexander the Great or Napoleon Bonaparte. With them, the military victories became the foundation of something enduring, a political structure that survived the death of its creator and that continued to function, with modifications, for 400 years. The lesson for our own time is clear, if painful to contemplate. The builders of institutions are rarely celebrated with the same enthusiasm as the winners of battles. The administrators who keep systems running are rarely honored with the same reverence as the commanders who expand the territory. The quiet work of governance, the work that Thutmose mastered during 22 years of watching Hatshepsut and that he perfected during 32 years of sole rule, is the work that makes civilization possible. It is the work that prevents the floods from destroying the crops, that ensures the roads are safe for travel, that maintains the judicial system, that resolves disputes without violence, that keeps the borders secure, that trains the army, that stocks the granaries, that manages the diplomatic correspondence, that collects the taxes, and that distributes the resources that sustain the lives of millions of people across thousands of square kilometers. The quiet work of governance, the work of maintaining the supply lines that sustain the army in the field, managing the diplomatic relationships that hold the coalition of allies and vassals together, adjudicating the disputes, collecting the tribute, and ensuring that the machinery of civilization continues to function, is essential but invisible, necessary but unglamorous, indispensable but unrewarded. Thutmose III was one of the rare figures in human history who combined both kinds of excellence, who was as brilliant an administrator as he was a general, as effective an institution builder as he was a battlefield commander. The combination was what made him unstoppable. The ruins of Thutmose's empire are scattered across 2 continents. In the Levant, the fortress towns and garrison cities that sustained Egyptian authority have been excavated at sites from Gaza to the Euphrates, yielding inscriptions in Egyptian and Akkadian, pottery in both local and imported styles, scarabs bearing the cartouche of Menkaper Thutmose, and administrative documents that record the daily functioning of the most sophisticated imperial system the Bronze Age had produced. In Nubia, the temples and fortresses that administered the southern provinces lie partly submerged beneath the waters of Lake Nasser, partly excavated and partly lost, monuments to a colonial enterprise that exploited the resources of Africa to fund the military campaigns of Asia. At Karnak, the annals of Thutmose III remain, carved into the walls of the sacred precinct, listing, year by year, the campaigns and the conquests and the tribute and the cities that constituted the pharaoh's gift to the god Amun and the god's gift to the pharaoh. The relationship between Thutmose and Amun was central to the pharaoh's self-presentation and to the theological framework within which the empire was constructed. Every campaign was, in theory, conducted on behalf of Amun, the supreme god of the Egyptian pantheon, the divine patron of the Theban dynasty, the deity whose temple at Karnak was the spiritual and administrative center of the new kingdom state. The tribute that flowed from the conquered territories was dedicated to Amun. The campaigns that secured the tribute were fought in Amun's name. The annals that recorded the campaigns were carved on the walls of Amun's temple. The entire imperial enterprise was, in the official theology of the new kingdom, a religious act, a fulfillment of the pharaoh's duty to maintain Mat by extending the authority of the gods across the known world. The physical legacy of Thutmose's campaigns is surprisingly modest. The great military commander did not build temples on the scale of Ramesses the Great, whose colossal monuments at Abu Simbel and Luxor dominate the modern tourist's experience of ancient Egypt. Thutmose's building program was extensive but restrained, focused on the Temple of Amun at Karnak, where his additions included the annals, the botanical garden, the festival hall, and a series of pylons and courts that expanded the sacred precinct to unprecedented dimensions. The restraint is itself revealing. It suggests a pharaoh who understood that the most important and the most enduring monuments are not necessarily the largest, but the most meaningful, and that the record of achievement inscribed on the walls of the god's house is a more enduring legacy than the colossal statues that later pharaohs would erect to compensate for military records that were far less impressive than Thutmose's. The tomb of Thutmose III, KV34 in the Valley of the Kings, was discovered in 1898 by the French Egyptologist Victor Loret, who found it in a remote location high in the cliffs of the valley, accessible only by a steep and narrow path that wound upward through the rock to a concealed entrance. The tomb is significant not just for its archaeological content, but for what it reveals about the man who commissioned it. Unlike the later royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, which became increasingly elaborate, increasingly decorated, and increasingly ostentatious as the new kingdom progressed, the tomb of Thutmose III is relatively modest. It is deep, well hidden, and functional rather than spectacular. The tomb of a man who valued security over display and who understood, perhaps more clearly than any of his predecessors, that the greatest threat to a pharaoh's eternal rest was not the judgment of the gods, but the greed of the tomb robbers who had been systematically plundering the royal burials since the end of the Old Kingdom. The tomb's decoration is unlike that of any other royal tomb in the valley. The walls are painted with stylized images from the Amduat, rendered in a cursive style that resembles handwriting more than formal inscription. as though the painters had transcribed the text directly from a papyrus scroll onto the wall. The effect is intimate, almost private, as though the tomb were a personal document, a private communication between the dead pharaoh and the gods who would receive him in the afterlife. A communication that was not meant for human eyes but for divine ones, not designed to impress visitors but to guide the deceased king through the perils of the underworld and deliver him, safely and completely, into the presence of the sun god Ra at the end of the nocturnal journey, rather than the public monument that most royal tombs were designed to be. The mummy of Thutmose III was not found in the tomb. It had been removed in antiquity during the period of tomb robbery that plagued the Valley of the Kings in the late New Kingdom, and relocated to the Great Royal Cache at Deir el-Bahari, where it was discovered in 1881 alongside the mummies of dozens of other pharaohs. The mummy itself tells a final story, a story that the annals and the monuments cannot tell. The body is that of a man of approximately medium height, a detail that has often been used to contrast Thutmose with the tall, imposing physical specimens that the relief sculptures of the New Kingdom pharaohs typically depict. The discrepancy between the modest physical stature revealed by the mummy and the colossal reputation established by the historical record is itself instructive. A reminder that military genius is a quality of the mind, not the body, and that the man who built the greatest empire of the ancient world was not the towering physical specimen that pharaonic art conventions required, but a man of ordinary height, between approximately 5 feet and 5 feet 4 inches tall, with a broad face and prominent features. The wrappings show signs of damage from ancient tomb robbers, and the body bears the marks of a life lived in physical exertion, the musculature of a man who spent decades in the chariot, the saddle, and the field. He was, by the time of his death, an old man by the standards of the ancient world, perhaps in his 50s or early 60s, having ruled for 54 years, the last 32 as sole pharaoh. He had outlived most of his contemporaries, most of his enemies, and most of the men who had served him during the great campaigns. The man who had waited 22 years for his chance, and who had seized that chance with a ferocity and a brilliance that the ancient world had never seen, died peacefully in his bed in the palace at Thebes. The death of Thutmose III must have been a moment of profound transition for the Egyptian state, the passing of a ruler who had dominated the political and military landscape of the ancient Near East for more than 3 decades, and whose personal authority had been the guarantor of the imperial system that sustained Egyptian power from the cataracts to the Euphrates. The question of whether the empire could survive without its creator, whether the institutions Thutmose had built were robust enough to function without the man who had designed them, would be answered by his successors, and the answer would prove to be yes. The empire endured, the system worked, the institutions held. He was buried by his son Amenhotep II in the tomb that had been prepared in the Valley of the Kings. And the empire he had built, the empire that stretched from the distant 5th cataract of the Nile in the south to the great river Euphrates in the north, the empire that encompassed more territory and more people than any state the ancient world had ever seen, endured. It is late, the walls of Karnak are dark, the annals, those meticulous, detailed, extraordinarily precise records of 17 campaigns across 20 years, are carved into stone that has endured for 34 centuries, and that will endure, barring catastrophe, for millennia more. The words are there, the elegant, confident, meticulously precise hieroglyphs that record the single most comprehensive, most detailed, and most reliable military history produced by any civilization of the ancient world. The lists are there, the tribute inventories, the captured cities, the booty assessments that provide modern historians with the most detailed picture available of the economic dimensions of Bronze Age warfare. The names of the cities, Megiddo, Kadesh, Byblos, Ni, Aleppo, Carchemish, are there, carved in hieroglyphs that the scribe Chanani transcribed from his leather campaign diary onto the walls of the god's house, so that Amun would know what the pharaoh had done in his name, and so that the generations who came after would know what the pharaoh had achieved. So here is the answer to the question we began with. What made Thutmose III unstoppable? It was not merely his tactical brilliance, though his tactical brilliance was extraordinary, as the Battle of Megiddo demonstrates. It was not merely his strategic vision, though his strategic vision, sustained across 17 campaigns over 20 years, was as comprehensive and as effective as that of any commander in the ancient world. It was not merely his logistical competence, though his ability to move armies across vast distances, to build boats and transport them overland, to maintain supply lines across hundreds of kilometers of hostile territory, was without parallel in the Bronze Age. And it was not merely his administrative innovation, though the vassal system, the hostage policy, the tribute networks, and the garrison structure that he created gave his empire a durability that no previous Near Eastern empire had achieved. What made Thutmose III unstoppable? What made him, in the final analysis, the most formidable ruler the ancient world had ever produced? Was all of these things together, combined in a single mind, a single will, a single career that unfolded across 5 decades, and that transformed permanently and irreversibly the political geography of the ancient world. He was a tactician, a strategist, a logistician, an administrator, a diplomat, a naturalist, an architect, and a patron of the arts. And he was all of these things simultaneously, with a consistency and an intensity that suggests a mind of extraordinary range, discipline, and adaptability. A mind that was simultaneously capable of planning a major military campaign across 1,000 kilometers and noticing a flower along the route of march, a mind that could process the strategic complexities of a multi-front war and the aesthetic possibilities of a botanical garden, a mind that was as comfortable and as intellectually engaged in the war council as in the temple workshop, as focused on the disposition of enemy forces as on the classification of foreign plant species, and that found, in both settings, the same quality of intense, focused, detail-oriented engagement that is the hallmark of genuine genius. He was also a man who had waited 22 years for his moment, and who, when that moment came, was ready. Not merely ready, but ravenously, explosively, irresistibly eager, prepared, sharpened by 2 decades of patience into a weapon that the ancient world could not withstand. The empire he built is gone. The vassal states that paid him tribute are archaeological sites. The chariot corps that thundered across the plain of Megiddo, the wheels that churned the earth, the hooves that shook the ground, the arrows that darkened the morning sky, is dust. The horses that pulled his golden chariot are bones. The soldiers who followed him through the Aruna Pass and across the Euphrates and through the forests of Ni, where the elephants charged. Those soldiers are names on tomb walls in the limestone hills above the Nile, names carved by proud sons recording the military service of their fathers, names that speak of battles fought and rewards received, and journeys taken to lands that no ordinary Egyptian would ever see, names that testify to the human cost of empire in the most direct and personal terms, available to the historical record in the hills above the Nile, names that no one reads except the archaeologists, who crawl through the narrow passages with their notebooks and their flashlights, and their patient, meticulous, essential curiosity about the dead. But the annals remain, the walls of Karnak remain, the record of what one man accomplished, rising from powerlessness to supremacy, from the shadow of his stepmother to the pinnacle of ancient power, from the boy who watched to the pharaoh who conquered, from the silent, marginal, politically irrelevant prince to the commander whose name was feared from the cataracts of the Nile to the banks of the Euphrates, remains carved in the stone of the god's house, where Chanini placed it 34 centuries ago, as permanent as human craft can make anything, as enduring as the stone of the Nile Valley itself. The leather scroll on which Chanini originally recorded the campaigns has long since crumbled to dust. Leather does not survive 3.5 millennia in the Egyptian climate, however dry, but the stone transcription endures. The hieroglyphs are as sharp and as legible as the day they were carved. The account of Megiddo, the lists of tribute, the catalogue of captured cities, the year-by-year record of an empire being built by a man who refused to accept that the limitations of his circumstances define the boundaries of his ambition. The world does not remember, most of the people who have lived in it. The vast majority of every civilization's inhabitants, the farmers, the craftsmen, the soldiers, the mothers, the children, pass through their lives and into oblivion without leaving any trace that the archaeological record can detect. The pharaohs are the exception. The men and women whose names were carved in stone, whose bodies were preserved in wrappings, whose achievements were inscribed on walls that were built to last forever. But even among the pharaohs, most are forgotten, their names unknown to anyone outside the specialist circles of academic Egyptology, their achievements reduced to a line in a textbook, their lives compressed into a parenthetical between dates that no one remembers. Thutmose III is not among the forgotten. His name is known, his campaigns are recorded, his empire is documented, his legacy is visible, tangible, measurable, archaeologically attested in the walls of Karnak, in the archaeological remains of the vassal cities he conquered, in the administrative structures he created, and in the strategic concepts, the institutional structures, and the administrative innovations he pioneered. Thutmose III waited 22 years, 22 long, frustrating, formative, ultimately indispensable years. He fought for 20 years of relentless, systematic, brilliantly conceived and flawlessly executed military campaigning. He ruled for 32 years as the sole unchallenged supreme authority of the greatest empire the ancient world had ever known. And in those 74 years, the span of a single human life, the blink of an eye in the history of civilizations, an interval so brief that the stone of the monuments he built has barely had time to weather, the hieroglyphs he carved have barely begun to fade. He built something that lasted for 400 years, and that shaped the world in which we live, in ways that we can trace, but never fully comprehend. The Aruna Pass is still there. The mountains of Carmel still rise above the plain of Megiddo. The great river Euphrates still flows from north to south, still flowing, as the Egyptians said, in the wrong direction. And somewhere in the silence between the ruins and the records, between the stone and the sand, between the empire that was and the world that is, a world that Thutmose helped to shape, that his campaigns helped to define, and that his empire helped to organize. The pharaoh who waited and the pharaoh who conquered the known world are the same man. Standing alone at the mouth of a narrow mountain pass, looking down at the plain where his assembled enemies are waiting, and making the decision, what would prove to be the single most consequential military decision in the entire history of the ancient world, the decision that will establish the Egyptian empire, the decision that will resonate across 4 centuries of subsequent history, that will change everything. The generals said, "Do not take the narrow path." The pharaoh took the narrow path. The generals were wrong. The pharaoh was right. And the vast, powerful, enduring empire that emerged from that single audacious world-changing decision, the empire of the Thutmosids, the empire of the New Kingdom, the greatest, the most administratively sophisticated, and the most durable empire the ancient world had ever seen. An empire that would serve as the model, the template, and the standard against which all subsequent empires of the ancient Near East would measure themselves, endured for 400 years, outlasting the men who built it, the dynasty that sustained it, and the civilization that conceived it, until the last traces were buried beneath the sand, and the silence that the desert wraps around all things, patient and complete and final, but not forgotten, never quite forgotten, because the annals remain, the stone endures. The name of Menkaper Thutmose, the pharaoh who waited, the pharaoh who conquered, the pharaoh who built an empire that lasted 400 years, is carved in the walls of the god's house at Karnak, where it has endured for 34 centuries, and where it will endure, in all probability, for centuries more. The empire is gone, the army is dust, the chariot is splinters, the horse is bone, but his name, survives. And in the survival of the name, something of the man survives with it. The patience, the brilliance, the discipline, the hunger, the refusal to accept limitation, and the quiet, devastating certainty that the narrow path is always the right path for the man who has the patience to prepare for it. Through years of silent, disciplined, unwavering effort and the courage to take it, without hesitation, when the long-awaited moment finally arrives. He chose the narrow path, the path that the generals said was too dangerous, the path that the textbooks said was too risky, the path that every reasonable calculation suggested he should avoid. He chose it because he understood something that his generals did not, that the narrow path was the only path that led to victory, and that the risk of taking it was less than the risk of not taking it. The narrow path at Megiddo was a geographical feature, but it was also a metaphor for the approach to power, to strategy, and to life that defined Thutmose III's career. He never took the easy road. He never chose the obvious option. He never settled for the safe, the conventional, the predictable. He chose, again and again, the path that required the most courage, the most preparation, and the most precise execution, the path that would have led to disaster in the hands of a lesser commander, but that, in his hands, led to empire. He always chose the narrow path, every time, without exception, without hesitation. At Megiddo, where the narrow path was a mountain defile, at the Euphrates, where the narrow path was a river that no one had crossed with an army before, and that flowed, as the Egyptians said, in the wrong direction. In the siege of Megiddo, where the narrow path was 7 months of patient, methodical, relentless strangulation, rather than the quick negotiated settlement that a lesser commander would have accepted. In the management of his empire, where the narrow path was the creation of institutions rather than the reliance on force alone. In his treatment of Hatshepsut, where the narrow path was 25 years of silence, followed by a calculated, politically motivated erasure rather than the immediate destruction that personal hatred would have demanded. He always chose the path that was harder, longer, more dangerous, and more effective. And the world, the ancient world, the modern world, every world that has come between, has never been the same.